On the 7th of January, 1982, a deputy noticed an orange bootie sock, half buried in the snow on Hoosier Pass, an overlooked clue that would take 40 years to explain. The night before, 21-year-old Annette Kay Schnee, shy but ambitious, left her housekeeping job in Breckenridge, dreaming of flight school. Hitchhiking was second nature in the mountains. She raised her thumb on Highway 9, her orange socks peeking beneath her jeans, and disappeared into the night. Just miles away, Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, 29, made the same mistake. By morning, she was dead, shot, and abandoned in the snow. Near her body lay the orange sock, its meaning unclear until 6 months later, when Annette's body was discovered still wearing the mate. 2 women, 1 killer, and 4 decades of silence. In 2021, DNA revealed the truth. Trusted neighbor Alan Lee Phillips had been the monster hiding in plain sight all along. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The snow fell thick and steady on Main Street, Breckenridge, that the 6th of January morning, coating the ski town in fresh powder that would bring tourists and their money. Annette Kay Schnee pushed through the Holiday Inn's employee entrance at 6:47 a.m., her breath visible in small puffs as she hurried toward the warmth. At 21, she carried herself with quiet determination, the kind that comes from working multiple jobs while chasing bigger dreams. The housekeeping cart squeaked as she rolled it down the carpeted hallway, her mind already calculating the day ahead. 12 rooms to clean, laundry to fold, and if she was lucky, she'd finish early enough to call her mother back in Iowa. The phone calls home were getting harder. How do you explain to your family that your mountain adventure is mostly scrubbing toilets and changing sheets for wealthy skiers who drop more on dinner than you make in a week? But Annette had a plan. The notebook in her locker was filled with airline training programs, application deadlines, and flight routes she'd memorized. Continental Airlines was hiring. United had openings in Denver. All she needed was enough money saved and the confidence to walk into those interviews knowing she belonged in the sky, not cleaning hotel rooms in the shadow of the Rockies. Room 237 was particularly messy. Beer bottles lined the windowsill, towels thrown across the floor, and the sheets reeked of cigarettes despite the no-smoking policy. Annette worked methodically, stripping beds and wiping surfaces while snow continued to pile against the windows. The tourists would be happy. Fresh powder meant perfect skiing conditions and generous tips for the service staff who made their vacation fantasies possible. The Holiday Inn lobby was buzzing with activity when Annette finally clocked out at 6:15 p.m. Families loaded with ski equipment pushed through the revolving doors, while the front desk staff juggled room assignments and dinner reservations. She pulled on her borrowed coat, a navy blue parka that belonged to her roommate Sarah, and stepped into the bitter January evening. Main Street glowed under the streetlights, shop windows displaying expensive ski gear and souvenir t-shirts. Annette walked the 3 blocks to Miller's Pharmacy, her boots crunching through snow that had been packed down by hundreds of tourist feet. The wind cut through her jeans, making her grateful for the thick orange socks she'd bought at a discount store in Denver. They were warm, distinctive, and cheerful against the winter landscape. Inside the pharmacy, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she gathered her small purchases: lip balm for the dry mountain air that cracked her lips by midday, a small bottle of aspirin for the headaches that came from cleaning chemical fumes and bending over beds for 8 hours straight. At the counter, Mrs. Peterson, who'd worked there for 15 years, barely looked up from her magazine as she rang up the total. "Cold one tonight," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who'd had the same conversation 1,000 times. "Sure is," Annette replied, tucking the receipt into her coat pocket. "But at least the snow's good for business." She pulled her knit cap down over her ears and pushed back into the night. The decision to hitchhike south wasn't unusual. Gas was expensive, and her friend Lisa lived just 15 minutes down Highway 9. It seemed like an easy way to visit before the evening got too late. Highway 9 stretched south from Breckenridge like a dark ribbon through the snow-covered valley. Annette found a good spot near the Conoco station, where drivers could safely pull over. Her thumb extended toward the sparse traffic. Cars passed at regular intervals, their headlights sweeping across her figure before disappearing into the mountain darkness. A few drivers noticed her. Tom Bradley, heading home to Alma after his shift at the copper mine, saw a young woman in a dark coat standing by the road. He was running late and his wife was waiting dinner, so he didn't stop. Later, he'd wish he had. Margaret Holt, driving her teenage daughter back from ski practice, pointed out the hitchhiker to her daughter, as a reminder about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. The irony wouldn't be lost on her for decades. The snow was picking up when the vehicle finally slowed. Annette couldn't make out the make or model in the darkness, just headlights and the shape of someone leaning across to unlock the passenger door. She hurried forward, her boots sliding slightly on the packed snow, and leaned down to speak through the window. "Where you headed?" a male voice asked. "Just down to Alma," she replied, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "I can get you part way." Annette opened the door and climbed inside. The heater was running, classic rock played softly on the radio, and the driver seemed normal enough. Middle-aged, work clothes, the kind of man you'd see at any diner or gas station in the valley. She settled into the seat and pulled the door closed with a solid click. That sound marked the end of her old life and the beginning of 40 years of questions. The employee dormitory at the Holiday Inn was quiet, except for the hum of the heating system and distant sounds of the night shift preparing for the dinner rush. Sarah Martinez sat on her narrow bed, flipping through a skiing magazine while occasionally glancing at the clock. Annette should have been back by now. She'd said she was just running to the drugstore and might stop by Lisa's place. But that was hours ago. At 9:30 p.m., Sarah walked down the hall to Lisa's room. Lisa answered the door in her robe, hair wet from the shower. "Is Annette here?" Sarah asked. "No. I haven't seen her since yesterday." "Why?" A cold feeling settled in Sarah's stomach. Annette was responsible, predictable. She didn't disappear without calling. She didn't take off on adventures without leaving word. Sarah returned to their shared room and checked Annette's side. Her bed was neatly made, her work uniform folded on the dresser, her notebook of airline information sitting exactly where she'd left it that morning. By 11 p.m., Sarah was pacing the small room. She called the front desk, hoping maybe Annette had picked up an extra shift, but the night manager confirmed she'd clocked out at 6:15. At midnight, Sarah called Annette's mother in Iowa. The conversation was painful, full of long pauses and growing worry. Annette's mother said, her voice tight with the fear every parent carries. "Something's wrong," Sarah agreed. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the 7th of January, she walked to the Breckenridge Police Department and filed a missing person report. Officer Williams took down the details with practiced efficiency, but his tone suggested this wasn't unusual. Young people took off sometimes. They got restless, impulsive. They'd usually turn up in a few days with stories and apologies. But Annette's mother knew better. She started making phone calls. The missing person flyer was simple. Annette's Holiday Inn employee photo, her basic information, and a plea for anyone with information to contact the Breckenridge police. Sarah and Lisa spent the 8th of January posting them at every ski shop, restaurant, and gas station in town. The photo showed Annette's shy smile and hopeful eyes, the same expression she'd worn when talking about flight attendant school. Detective Ray Collar took over the case on the 9th of January. A 20-year veteran of mountain law enforcement, he'd worked missing person cases before, though most ended with embarrassed young adults returning home after a few days of adventure. This one felt different. Annette's background check revealed no history of running away, no drug use, no romantic drama that might explain a sudden departure. The investigation followed standard procedures. Officers canvassed the area where she was last seen, interviewed her co-workers and friends, and checked bus stations and airports throughout the region. The drugstore receipt in her coat pocket suggested she'd completed her errand as planned. The question was, what happened next? Collar drove Highway 9 multiple times, stopping at every business between Breckenridge and Alma. Gas station attendants, restaurant workers, and shop owners all received copies of Annette's photo. A few thought they might have seen her, but the memories were vague, uncertain. The 6th of January had been busy with tourists, and one young woman in winter clothes looked much like another. The first real lead came on the 12th of January, when a truck driver reported seeing a woman matching Annette's description hitchhiking near the Conoco station on the evening she disappeared. His description matched: dark coat, knit cap, and distinctive orange socks visible beneath her jeans. The detail about the socks struck Collar as specific enough to be credible, but the lead went nowhere. No one had seen her get into a vehicle, and the truck driver couldn't provide any details about other cars in the area. The trail went cold at the side of Highway 9. January in the Colorado Rockies meant brutal conditions for search teams. Temperatures dropped well below zero at night, and fresh snow fell almost daily, erasing tracks and hiding evidence. Despite the challenges, volunteers from Breckenridge and surrounding communities organized systematic searches of the area where Annette had last been seen. The Summit County Search and Rescue Team mobilized on the 15th of January. Volunteers on cross-country skis and snowmobiles covered miles of backcountry, following every road, trail, and creek bed within a reasonable radius of town. They checked abandoned buildings, mine shafts, and natural shelters where someone might take refuge from a storm. Detective Collar coordinated with neighboring law enforcement agencies, expanding the search to include Park and Lake counties. The theory was that Annette might have gotten into a vehicle traveling south toward Denver or west toward Vail. But with hundreds of square miles of wilderness and limited manpower, the search felt overwhelming. The community response surprised everyone. Local businesses donated food and supplies for search teams. Radio stations broadcast appeals for information. The Breckenridge ski resort allowed volunteers to post flyers in the lodge, and lift operators kept watch for any sign of disturbance in the backcountry areas accessible by the gondolas. Annette's mother arrived from Iowa on the 18th of January, a small woman with tired eyes who carried herself with quiet determination. She spent days walking through town, visiting every place her daughter might have gone, talking to anyone who would listen. Her presence added urgency to the search efforts and kept Annette's story in the local news. But as January turned to February, the harsh reality set in. The mountains had swallowed Annette as completely as they'd swallowed hundreds of others over the years. Without more specific leads, the active search couldn't continue indefinitely. The case remained open, but the daily efforts gradually wound down. The 7th of January had started as a routine morning for Deputy Pete Martinez of the Park County Sheriff's Department. He was responding to reports of a body found at Hoosier Pass, a grim discovery that unfortunately wasn't uncommon in the Colorado mountains. Winter claimed victims regularly: hypothermia, avalanches, vehicle accidents on icy roads, but this case would prove to be something else entirely. The body lay face down in a shallow depression off the main road, partially covered by overnight snow. Martinez could see immediately that this wasn't an accident. The young woman had been shot in the back, her body positioned in a way that suggested she'd been dumped rather than falling naturally. This was murder. The victim was later identified as Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, a 29-year-old woman from the area who had also been reported missing by her husband Jeff just hours earlier. Like Annette, she'd been hitchhiking when she disappeared. Unlike Annette, her body had been found quickly, before the mountain weather could destroy evidence. As Martinez and the crime scene team processed the area, they found something that seemed minor at the time: a single orange bootie sock lying in the snow about 10 feet from the body. It appeared to be women's clothing, but Bobbie Jo was wearing different socks when found. The crime scene photographer documented it, and the sock was bagged as evidence, though no one could explain its significance. The investigation into Bobbie Jo's murder began immediately. Her husband Jeff became the primary suspect, as spouses often do in domestic homicides. But Jeff's alibi was solid, and his grief appeared genuine. As weeks passed with no arrest, investigators began considering the possibility that Bobbie Jo's killer was a stranger, someone who'd offered her a ride and then murdered her for reasons they couldn't understand. The orange sock sat in the evidence room, a small mystery within a larger tragedy. The Breckenridge Bulletin's headline on the 15th of January read, "Two women missing in mountain communities," and the story that followed sent ripples of fear through the usually peaceful valley. Residents who'd never locked their doors began checking deadbolts. Parents who'd allowed their teenage daughters to hitchhike home from jobs suddenly insisted on picking them up personally. The paper's coverage was careful but clear. Two young women had vanished within hours of each other while hitchhiking on mountain roads. One was still missing, the other had been found murdered. The implication was obvious, even if the police weren't ready to officially connect the cases. A predator was active in the area. Betty Walsh, who ran the newspaper with her husband for 30 years, had covered mining accidents, avalanche deaths, and the occasional bar fight, but never a serial crime. She found herself struggling to write about something so foreign to the community's experience. Breckenridge was supposed to be safe, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, and the biggest crimes were drunk skiing and petty theft from vacation rentals. The fear was palpable at town meetings and coffee shops. Conversations that once centered on snow conditions and tourist complaints now focused on personal safety. Women began traveling in pairs, and the practice of hitchhiking, once as common as skiing itself, virtually disappeared overnight. Sheriff's deputies increased their patrols, but with limited resources and vast territory to cover, their presence was more symbolic than practical. The reality was that if someone wanted to commit crimes in the backcountry, they had countless opportunities and plenty of places to hide evidence. As February wore on without arrests or major breaks in either case, the fear began to transform into something else: resignation. The mountains were dangerous in ways people were only beginning to understand. The television interview was arranged for the 20th of February, 6 weeks after Annette's disappearance. Her mother sat in the Coosa television studio in Denver, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she spoke directly to the camera with the kind of controlled desperation that only a parent of a missing child can manage. "Annette is not the kind of girl who would just take off," she said, her voice steady but strained. "She calls me every Sunday evening. She's been doing that since she moved to Colorado 2 years ago. She's never missed a call, not once. She was saving money for flight attendant school, she had plans, goals. She wouldn't abandon everything without saying goodbye. The interviewer, a veteran reporter named Jim Morrison, asked gentle questions about Annette's personality, her dreams, her life in Breckenridge. What emerged was a portrait of a young woman who was cautious by nature, responsible, and deeply connected to her family, despite the distance. It didn't fit the profile of someone who would vanish voluntarily. "I know something terrible has happened to her," her mother continued. "I can feel it. But I also believe someone out there knows something, saw something, that could help us find her. I'm begging anyone who has information, no matter how small it might seem, to please come forward." The interview aired on the 22nd of February and was picked up by other Colorado stations. The response was immediate. Dozens of tips flooded into the Breckenridge Police Department. Most were well-intentioned, but ultimately useless. Vague sightings from weeks earlier, second-hand stories, and theories that led nowhere. But the interview served another purpose. It kept Annette's case in the public consciousness and demonstrated that someone who loved her was fighting to keep her story alive. In missing person cases, public attention could mean the difference between active investigation and forgotten files. The candlelight vigil was held on the 28th of February in Breckenridge's town square, a small gathering of friends, co-workers, and community members who wanted to show support for Annette's family and keep her memory visible. About 50 people attended, their faces illuminated by flickering candles as they stood in a circle on the snowy ground. Sarah Martinez spoke first, her voice carrying across the quiet square. "Annette was my roommate, but she was more than that. She was my friend, someone I could talk to about everything. She listened when I complained about work, encouraged me when I doubted myself, and always shared her snacks when I was broke at the end of the month." Lisa Johnson followed, sharing memories of Annette's determination to become a flight attendant. She used to practice her smile in the mirror, saying she wanted passengers to feel welcome and safe when they saw her. She studied airline routes like other people studied for college exams. She was going to make it. I know she was. Detective Caller attended the vigil, standing at the back of the crowd with his badge visible but his expression grave. He'd seen these gatherings before, and they always marked a transition point in missing person cases. The first weeks were about hope and active searching. The vigils came when hope began to fade, when families needed community support to face an uncertain future. Annette's mother spoke last, her words simple but powerful. "I don't know where my daughter is tonight, but I know she's not forgotten. As long as people remember her, as long as someone is looking, there's still hope. I won't give up on her. I can't." The candles burned for nearly an hour, as people shared quiet conversations and memories. When the gathering finally dispersed, small pools of wax marked the snow where they'd stood, temporary memorials that would melt with the morning Sunday. March brought warmer temperatures and the beginning of snowmelt throughout the Colorado Rockies. For search teams, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Receding snow might reveal evidence that had been buried all winter, but the same melting created dangerous conditions with unstable snowpack and swollen streams. Detective Kohler organized renewed search efforts, focused on areas that had been inaccessible during the worst winter weather. Teams with metal detectors worked through valleys and creek beds, looking for anything that might belong to Annette: jewelry, clothing, personal items that could provide clues about what happened to her. The searches were methodical but frustrating. Winter in the high country was harsh enough to destroy or scatter evidence, and the terrain offered countless places where someone could hide a body. Mine shafts, remote cabins, dense forest areas that hadn't been logged in decades. The possibilities seemed endless. As April arrived and tourist season began gearing up for summer hiking and fishing, the active search efforts were scaled back to occasional weekend volunteers. The case remained open and active, but the reality was that without new leads or witnesses, investigators were operating blind. Kohler spent long hours reviewing the file, looking for connections or details that might have been missed in the initial investigation. The similarity to Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's case was obvious. Both women hitchhiking, both disappearing on the same night, both young and alone. But without Annette's body, he couldn't prove they were connected. The detective often found himself driving the routes where both women had last been seen, trying to think like their killer. What was he looking for? Why these particular victims? Where would he take someone if he wanted to avoid detection? The questions haunted him, but the mountains kept their secrets. The 6th of June marked 6 months since Annette's disappearance, a milestone that her mother acknowledged by placing a half-page advertisement in the Denver Post. The ad featured Annette's photo and a simple message: still missing, still loved, still searching. It ran for a week and generated a handful of new tips, but nothing that advanced the investigation. Sarah Martinez left Breckenridge that month, unable to continue living in the place where her friend had vanished. The employee dormitory room they'd shared felt haunted, and every familiar location in town carried memories that had become too painful to bear. She moved to Denver and found work at a downtown hotel, but she called Detective Caller monthly to check on the case's progress. The passage of time was particularly cruel for Annette's family. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries became reminders of absence rather than celebrations. Her mother marked the 15th of July, Annette's 22nd birthday, by visiting Breckenridge and leaving flowers at the spot on Highway 9, where witnesses had last seen her daughter. Detective Caller found himself thinking about the case during off hours, wondering what he might have missed, or what approach might still yield results. He'd worked missing person cases that were solved years later when new witnesses came forward, or evidence was discovered during unrelated activities. But he'd also worked cases that were never solved, families that never got answers. The investigation continued in a more limited way. New tips were followed up, though most led nowhere. The case files grew thicker, with reports of dead-end interviews and fruitless searches. And in the evidence room, Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's orange sock remained catalogued and stored, a puzzle piece waiting for someone to understand its significance. By year's end, Annette Schnee had joined the ranks of Colorado's missing persons, her case file transferred to a special unit that handled long-term investigations. The 3rd of July, 1982, was supposed to be a perfect day for fishing. 12-year-old Tommy Chen had convinced his father to drive up to Park County for an afternoon on the stream that ran through the valley near Hoosier Pass. The water was running high from snowmelt, but that often meant good fishing if you knew where to look for the deeper pools where trout gathered. Tommy worked his way downstream while his father tried his luck at a beaver pond higher up the creek. The boy was focused on reading the water, looking for the telltale signs of fish feeding beneath the surface, when something caught his eye in a shallow area where the current had slowed. At first, he thought it might be a discarded mannequin from some retail store, the kind of thing that occasionally got dumped in remote areas by people who didn't want to pay disposal fees. But as he got closer, the horrible reality became clear. This was a human body, face down in the creek, held in place by rocks and debris that had accumulated over months of flowing water. Tommy ran back upstream, calling for his father with a voice that cracked with panic. His father took one look at what his son had found and immediately drove to the nearest telephone to call the Park County Sheriff's Department. Within 2 hours, the remote creek bed was swarming with investigators, crime scene photographers, and the coroner. The body was remarkably well preserved, protected by cold mountain water, and partially buried in silt. The victim appeared to be a young woman, and most importantly, she'd been shot in the back with what looked like a small caliber weapon. This wasn't an accidental death or suicide. This was murder. As the body was carefully extracted from the creek, investigators noticed something that made Detective Martinez's pulse quicken. On the victim's left foot was an orange bootie sock, identical to the one found at Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's murder scene 6 months earlier. The dental records confirmation came on the 6th of July, 3 days after the body's discovery. Dr. Patricia Winters, the forensic odontologist who'd been called in from Denver, spent hours comparing x-rays and dental charts before making the official identification. The body found in the creek was definitely Annette Kay Schnee. Detective Caller received the call at 3:17 p.m. while he was reviewing witness statements from Annette's original disappearance. The news hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd suspected this outcome for months. Finding a body brought a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the family would finally have answers, and grief for the confirmation of what everyone had feared. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed that Annette had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the back, fired from close range with what appeared to be a .22 caliber weapon. The bullet had passed through her heart, causing almost instantaneous death. There were no signs of sexual assault or other trauma, suggesting the motive might have been robbery or simply the random violence of someone who killed for the pleasure of it. Most importantly, the orange sock provided the definitive link to Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's murder. The socks were identical in brand, style, and color, clearly a matching pair that had been separated when the killer dumped his victims in different locations. For the first time in 6 months, investigators had solid physical evidence connecting the two cases. Detective Caller called Annette's mother personally to inform her of the identification. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was one of the most difficult calls he'd ever had to make. Her response was quietly devastating. "Thank you for finding her. Now we can bring her home." The investigation that had been a missing person case for 6 months suddenly became a double homicide with a serial killer still at large. 2020 arrived with a new detective and new possibilities. Park County Detective Sergeant Wendy Kipple had built her reputation on cold cases, using modern forensic techniques to solve crimes that had frustrated investigators for decades. When she took over the Schnee Oberholtzer files in January 2020, she brought fresh eyes and cutting-edge technology to evidence that had been gathering dust for 38 years. Kipple spent her first month reading every report, studying every photograph, and cataloging every piece of physical evidence. The orange socks were still in storage, perfectly preserved in climate-controlled conditions. More importantly, there were biological samples from Bobbie Jo's murder scene that had never been fully tested, because DNA analysis didn't exist in 1982. The technology that would crack this case had been science fiction when the murders occurred. Forensic genetic genealogy combined traditional DNA analysis with public genealogy databases to identify suspects through family connections. It was the same technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case and dozens of other cold cases across the country. In March 2020, despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, Kipple sent preserved evidence samples to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in forensic genealogy. The process would take months, but if the DNA was viable and if the killer's family members had submitted their genetic information to ancestry websites, there was a real chance of identifying him after 4 decades. Kipple also reached out to the surviving family members, including Annette's elderly mother, who was still living in Iowa. The conversation was emotional, filled with hope tempered by the reality that justice delayed might not be justice at all, but for the first time in decades, there was real reason for optimism. The evidence boxes that had sat unopened for years suddenly represented the key to solving 2 murders and bringing peace to families who'd waited far too long for answers. The call from Parabon Nanolabs came on the 15th of October, 2020. Genetic genealogist CECE Moore had spent months building family trees from the DNA profile extracted from evidence at Bobbie Jo's murder scene. The process was painstaking, involving the analysis of thousands of genetic markers and the construction of detailed genealogical charts going back multiple generations. "We've narrowed it down to 2 brothers," Moore told Detective Kipple during their video conference call. "The DNA profile matches both of them equally, which means the killer is definitely one of these 2 men. Both were living in Colorado in 1982, and both had access to the areas where the crimes occurred." The names on the genealogy chart were Alan Lee Phillips and his younger brother Robert. Alan was 66 years old in 2020, a retired miner who'd lived in Colorado most of his life. Robert had died in a car accident in 1995. The timing meant that if the killer was still alive, it was almost certainly Alan. Kipple began a careful background investigation of both brothers. What she discovered was fascinating and disturbing. On the night of the 6th of January, 1982, Alan Phillips had been rescued from a snowstorm in the same general area where both women disappeared. Search and rescue records showed that he'd been found near Hoosier Pass, hypothermic but alive, after his vehicle had gone off the road during the blizzard. The rescue had established his presence in the area at exactly the right time, but it had also provided him with what seemed like a perfect alibi. How could he have committed 2 murders on the same night he'd needed rescuing from a life-threatening situation? As Kipple dug deeper into the records, a different story began to emerge. Phillips hadn't been stranded by accident. His vehicle had been deliberately driven off the road after he'd disposed of both bodies, creating a cover story that had fooled investigators for 38 years. The covert surveillance of Alan Lee Phillips began in November 2020 and continued for 3 months. Detective Kipple worked with a team of investigators to document his daily routines, map his associates, and look for opportunities to collect his DNA without alerting him to the investigation. The process required patience and careful planning, as they had only one chance to get it right. Phillips lived in a modest house in rural Colorado with his wife of 40 years. He had 2 adult children, 4 grandchildren, and a reputation in the community as a reliable, if unremarkable, man. Neighbors described him as quiet, hardworking, and helpful when needed. No one suspected that the friendly grandfather who cleared snow from elderly neighbors' driveways had murdered 2 young women decades earlier. The surveillance revealed a man living a carefully controlled life. Phillips rarely deviated from established routines: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, coffee with retired mining friends on Thursday mornings, and visits to his grandchildren on weekends. He drove the speed limit, paid his bills on time, and had no criminal record beyond a few minor traffic violations. But there were subtle signs of anxiety that suggested he might be aware he was being watched. Phillips began checking his rearview mirror more frequently while driving. He started taking different routes to familiar destinations. Most tellingly, he avoided discussing the past when conversation with friends turned to local history or unsolved crimes. The breakthrough came on the 18th of February, 2021, when Phillips threw away a fast food napkin after lunch at a local diner. Detective Kipple retrieved it from the restaurant's dumpster and immediately sent it to the lab for DNA analysis. The process would take 2 weeks, but those 14 days would determine whether 4 decades of investigation had finally identified the right man. The waiting was agonizing for everyone involved, especially the victims' families who'd been briefed on the progress of the investigation. The DNA report arrived by email on the 4th of March, 2021. At 2:47 p.m., Detective Kipple was at her desk reviewing other case files when the message notification appeared on her computer screen. She'd been expecting this moment for 2 weeks, but her hand still trembled slightly as she opened the attachment that would either solve 2 murders or send the investigation back to square one. The results were unambiguous. The DNA profile from Alan Phillips' napkin was a perfect match to the genetic material recovered from Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer's murder scene in 1982. After 39 years, they had their killer. Kipple immediately called the district attorney's office to begin the process of obtaining an arrest warrant. The evidence was solid: DNA match, opportunity proven by rescue records placing him at the scene, and the connected murders of 2 women who'd been hitchhiking on the same night. It was enough to convince any jury, assuming Phillips lived long enough to stand trial. The arrest was scheduled for the 24th of February, 2021, exactly 1 week after the DNA confirmation. Kipple wanted to coordinate with multiple agencies to ensure Phillips couldn't escape once he realized the investigation had focused on him. After nearly 4 decades of freedom, Alan Lee Phillips was about to face justice for his crimes. The detective spent the evening before the arrest calling the victims' families. Annette's mother was 91 years old now, living in an assisted care facility in Iowa. Her voice was weak, but her mind was sharp when Kipple explained that they'd finally identified her daughter's killer. "Will I live long enough to see him convicted?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for decades. "I believe you will," Kipple replied, hoping it was true. The 24th of February, 2021, dawned clear and cold across Colorado's high country. Detective Kipple and her team positioned themselves along Phillips's normal route, a town, a rural highway he traveled every Wednesday to run errands and have coffee with friends. The plan was simple: a routine traffic stop that would end with Phillips in handcuffs, and the case finally closed. At 10:23 a.m., Phillips's pickup truck appeared on schedule, traveling at exactly the speed limit as always. Deputy Morgan pulled in behind him and activated his emergency lights, watching as Phillips carefully signaled and pulled to the shoulder. There was no attempt to flee, no sign that he understood his decades of freedom were about to end. Phillips rolled down his window as Deputy Morgan approached, his expression showing mild confusion rather than panic. He looked older than his 67 years, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his working life outdoors. His hands remained visible on the steering wheel, and his voice was calm when he asked why he'd been stopped. "Alan Lee Phillips, you're under arrest for the murders of Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer," Morgan said, his words carrying across the quiet highway like thunder. Phillips' expression changed only slightly, a brief flicker of something that might have been resignation before his face returned to careful neutrality. He stepped out of the truck without resistance, placed his hands behind his back, and remained silent as the handcuffs clicked into place. The moment was anticlimactic after 39 years of investigation. No dramatic chase, no confession, no explanation of why he'd killed 2 innocent women on a snowy night in 1982. Just a quiet arrest on a mountain highway and the beginning of the legal process that would finally deliver justice. As Phillips was driven away, Detective Kipple stood by his abandoned truck and felt the weight of nearly 4 decades settling on her shoulders. The preliminary hearing was held on the 15th of March, 2021, in Park County District Court. Phillips appeared in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his demeanor unchanged from the day of his arrest. His court-appointed attorney, David Martinez, had the thankless task of defending a client whose guilt seemed overwhelming based on the DNA evidence. District Attorney Linda Stanley outlined the prosecution's case in clear, methodical terms. The DNA match was perfect, placing Phillips at both crime scenes with scientific certainty that exceeded 99.9%. The rescue records established his presence in the area at the time of the murders. The similar method of killing and the connected orange socks proved the murders were committed by the same person. Phillips entered a plea of not guilty, as expected, though his attorney's arguments focused more on procedural issues than actual innocence. The defense questioned the chain of custody for evidence that had been stored for nearly 4 decades and challenged the reliability of forensic genealogy as an investigative technique. But the science was solid, and the prosecution had been careful to follow proper procedures throughout the investigation. Judge Sarah Peterson ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and set a court date for September 2022, allowing both sides time to prepare their cases. The hearing was attended by members of both victims' families, including Annette's elderly mother who had traveled from Iowa with the help of relatives. Seeing Phillips in person was difficult for them. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it was hard to reconcile his appearance with the brutality of his crimes. Jeff Oberholtzer, Bobbie Jo's widower, spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse. "I've waited 40 years for this day," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Nothing can bring my wife back, but at least now we know who took her from us." The trial of Alan Lee Phillips began on the 12th of September, 2022, with jury selection that took 3 days. The case had received significant media attention throughout Colorado, and finding jurors who hadn't formed opinions about Phillips' guilt proved challenging. Eventually, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated, representing a cross-section of mountain communities similar to where the original crimes had occurred. Prosecutor Linda Stanley's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. She walked the jury through the events of the 6th of January, 1982, describing how 2 young women had made the fatal mistake of trusting Alan Phillips when he offered them rides. She explained how Phillips had killed both women, dumped their bodies in different locations, and then staged his own rescue to create an alibi that had worked for 39 years. The defendant lived a double life, Stanley told the jury. To his family and community, he was a reliable husband, father, and neighbor. But on that January night, he revealed his true nature. He was a predator who saw opportunity in 2 vulnerable young women and chose murder over mercy. The DNA evidence was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Expert witnesses explained how genetic material had been preserved from the 1982 crime scene and how modern forensic genealogy had identified Phillips as the source. The statistics were overwhelming. The chance that someone other than Phillips had left that DNA was approximately 1 in several trillion. Phillips's defense attorney argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, couldn't prove when it had been deposited at the crime scene. He suggested that Phillips might have encountered the victims in some innocent context before someone else murdered them. But the argument seemed desperate, unsupported by any alternative theory or evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from forensic experts, investigating officers, and family members of both victims. Phillips remained silent throughout, occasionally whispering to his attorney but never taking the stand in his own defense. The jury deliberated for 6 hours across 2 days, before reaching their verdict. On the 3rd of October, 2022, they returned to the packed courtroom to deliver their decision. Phillips stood at the defendant's table, his expression unchanged as the jury foreman prepared to read the verdict that would determine the rest of his life. In the case of the people of Colorado versus Alan Lee Phillips, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Annette Kay Schnee, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom as 40 years of uncertainty finally ended. But the jury wasn't finished. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of kidnapping related to both victims, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. Phillips showed no reaction to the verdicts, his face maintaining the same neutral expression he'd worn throughout the trial. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Phillips neither acknowledged the gesture nor looked toward the gallery where his own family sat in stunned silence. For the victims' families, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had finally arrived, but it came too late for some who died waiting for answers. Annette's mother, now 92, sat in a wheelchair in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She'd lived long enough to see her daughter's killer convicted, fulfilling the promise Detective Kipple had made months earlier. Jeff Oberholtzer, now in his 70s, felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. The man who'd killed his wife was finally facing consequences, but the verdict couldn't restore the life they'd planned together or erase 4 decades of wondering what had happened that night. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Stanley addressed the media. Today's verdict doesn't bring back Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer, but it does ensure that their killer will never hurt anyone else. The 18th of November, 2022, was sentencing day. Judge Peterson's courtroom was packed with family members, law enforcement officers, and media representatives who'd followed the case from arrest through trial. Phillips was brought in wearing the same orange jumpsuit he'd worn throughout the proceedings, his demeanor as impassive as ever. The prosecution requested consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, arguing that Phillips had committed 2 separate murders and deserved the maximum penalty under Colorado law. The defense asked for concurrent sentences, suggesting that Phillips' age and lack of prior criminal history warranted some consideration. But it was the victim impact statements that provided the most powerful moments of the hearing. Annette's surviving relatives spoke about 4 decades of unanswered questions and the pain of never being able to say goodbye. Jeff Oberholtzer, his voice breaking with emotion, described how his wife's murder had shaped every day of the last 40 years. "I was 29 years old when my wife was killed," he said, looking directly at Phillips. "I'm 71 now. I've lived most of my life wondering who took her from me and why. Today I finally have those answers, but I'll never have her back." When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Phillips declined. His silence was consistent with his behavior throughout the legal proceedings, leaving his motives and thoughts about his crimes forever unknown. Judge Peterson sentenced Phillips to 2 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole plus additional time for the kidnapping charges. At 68 years old, Phillips would almost certainly die in prison, ending a life that had been divided between ordinary respectability and hidden brutality. As he was led away in shackles, Phillips looked neither at his family nor at his victims' relatives. The man who'd terrorized the mountain community 40 years earlier disappeared into the Colorado prison system, where he would spend whatever remained of his life. The call came to Detective Kipple on the 14th of February, 2023, exactly 1 year after Phillips' arrest. The Colorado Department of Corrections reported that Alan Lee Phillips had been found dead in his cell at the Colorado State Penitentiary, an apparent suicide. He'd hanged himself using bedsheets during the night shift, when guards made their rounds every 2 hours. Phillips had been in prison for less than 3 months, serving his consecutive life sentences in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. He'd received few visitors and had made no friends among the other inmates. According to prison records, he'd spent most of his time reading and sleeping, rarely participating in activities or programs available to long-term prisoners. The suicide note he left behind was brief and offered no explanation for his crimes or apology to his victims' families. It simply stated that he preferred to choose the time and manner of his death rather than wait for natural causes to claim him. Even in death, Phillips revealed nothing about his motives or expressed any remorse for the lives he'd destroyed. News of Phillips's suicide reached the victims' families within hours. For some, it brought a sense of closure. The killer would never have the opportunity to appeal his conviction or gain notoriety through future court proceedings. For others, it felt like a final act of cowardice, robbing them of the chance to confront him during the appeals process or to hear him explain why he'd committed such senseless murders. Detective Kipple drove to the scene where Annette's body had been discovered 41 years earlier. The creek still flowed through the valley, clear and cold as it had been on that July day when a young boy's fishing trip had uncovered the truth about a January night of terror. She stood by the water for several minutes, thinking about justice delayed but finally delivered. The memorial gathering took place on the 15th of March, 2023, a quiet ceremony in Breckenridge, where friends and family members came together to remember Annette Schnee and Bobbie Jo Oberholtzer. The location was the same town square where candlelight vigils had been held decades earlier, when the community still hoped both women might somehow be found alive. Spring was beginning to show in the high country, with patches of bare ground visible through the remaining snow, and the first tentative signs of budding on the aspen trees. The seasonal change felt symbolic to many who attended, the end of a long, cold winter and the beginning of something new. Detective Kipple spoke about the investigation that had finally brought justice to the case. She acknowledged the patience of the families who'd waited 4 decades for answers and the dedication of previous investigators who'd kept the case files active when it would have been easier to let them fade away. "Science gave us the tools to solve this case," she said, "but it was love that kept it alive. The love of families who refused to give up, the love of a community that never forgot, and the love of officers who carried these women's stories in their hearts for years." Jeff Oberholtzer, now 72 and in declining health, had made the trip from his home in Denver to attend the ceremony. He placed a bouquet of white roses at the base of the memorial marker that had been installed years earlier, his hands shaking slightly as he straightened the ribbon that bore his wife's name. Annette's family was represented by cousins and nieces who'd maintained her memory across the decades. They brought orange flowers, bright marigolds and tulips that echoed the color of the socks that had connected the 2 murders and ultimately led to the killer's identification. As the ceremony concluded and the small crowd began to disperse, The flowers remained in the snow, not as symbols of death and violence, but as reminders that truth can emerge from even the longest darkness.